with the electric dynamo in the 19th century, nuclear age, and so forth. So all of this is to say we are very much paced by large technological changes. The dominant technological changes of our day came out of the wonderful imagination of Alan Turing and John von Neumann and the architects of the digital world with the transistors and integrated circuits, and this is a deep transformation that is propelling us today. So in good classical Enlightenment form, I approach this as a stadial theory of change, meaning you make stages. I designate 7 stages. I won't go through them in this brief period, but each is paced by major technological change, which gives rise to political change. It creates city-states, or nations, or empires, or transoceanic empires. And we are in another phase of fundamental political change. So just a word about the geography of long-term development. An unbelievable amount of economic development takes place between these narrow latitudes because they are favored with the lucky fortune of a band of east-west geography of temperate and semi-arid zone steppelands and temperate agriculture, which encompassed typically 70 or 80% of the world population, and almost all of the technological changes in history, and the major empires line up incredibly along this line throughout history. So in most of human history, Asia was, from as far back as we know it, the most populated part of the world, 65 to 70% of world population. China and India have been giants in population for 2 millennia at least. And for most of that time, per capita income didn't vary so much as we know, and I'm using Angus Madison's famous estimates here. It meant that these shares of output more or less tracked the shares of population, with the modest variation for different periods, like the Song Dynasty being a particularly prosperous period in China, for example. But aside from the ups and downs, Asia was the center of gravity of the world system. Then, of course, this began to change very gradually after the beginning of the 16th century in the so-called Age of Discovery or Age of Conquest, and it really took off after the end of the 18th century because of the steam engine, fundamentally, the era of industrialization. And since that came to England first, England used that to conquer much of the world. Just to say, as everybody knows, it is the great accident of history that Europe became the first to industrialize and to conquer Asia, because it was absolutely far more likely, I'd say something like 10 to 1 in favor of China in the 15th century, that it would go the other way. China was very close to discovering the sea routes to Europe and even possibly to the Americas across the northern Pacific. But in 1434, the single worst economic policy mistake in human history was made when the mandarins at the Ming court scrapped the Chinese fleet and just ended what was the mega age of discovery and oceanic transport of the giant fleets of Admiral Zheng He. Absolutely no deep reason for it. It was a catastrophic mistake. The next time the sea routes were opened between Europe and Asia was Europeans going to conquer Asia, not Asians going to explore and trade with Europe. So Columbus and Vasco da Gama. And my favorite lines from The Wealth of Nations, which is a remarkably wonderful and humane book, as well as a brilliant treatise. But my favorite part is this. Adam Smith says, the discovery of America and that of a passage to the East Indies by the Cape of Good Hope, that's 1498, and 1492 are the two greatest and most important events recorded in the history of mankind. Big statement. Not bad. Connecting the whole world by these two oceanic voyages. Their consequences have already been very great, but in the short period of between 2 and 3 centuries, because Smith is writing in 1776, which has elapsed since these discoveries were made, it is impossible that the whole extent of their consequences can have been seen. And then what's wonderful about Smith in the Scottish Enlightenment is he points out that while this was generally a beneficial fact to unite the world, it was disastrous for the native inhabitants of the East and West Indies, he says, because he says that they were relatively weak at the time. He didn't understand that they also brought pathogens of the old world to the Americas that wiped out the population. So Smith could not have understood that, but he did understand conquest. And he said something incredibly humane at the end, which I think marks him as one of the great thinkers of modern times. He said, "Hereafter, perhaps, the natives of those countries may grow stronger, or those of Europe may grow weaker, and the inhabitants of all the different quarters of the world may arrive at that equality of courage and force, which by inspiring mutual fear can alone overawe the injustice of independent nations into some sort of respect for the rights of one another. But nothing seems more likely to establish this equality of force than that mutual communication of knowledge and of all sorts of improvements which an extensive commerce from all countries to all countries naturally, or rather necessarily, carries along with it." So what Smith is saying is, in the future, there's going to come an equality because trade is going to carry knowledge, technological improvement, and an equality of force. Basically, we are 250 years after Smith's writing, and that prediction has come true now. So Smith was in the middle of a 500-year period. 500 years ago, Asia in the lead and the center of gravity and in the technological lead. Europe becomes the agent of change. The steam engine, a reflection of that, not something that came out of the blue, but came out of Francis Bacon and Isaac Newton and empire. But it came out of a Glasgow workshop, the condenser on James Watt's steam engine. And there came a new European and North Atlantic-led world. But as Adam Smith said, eventually trade will rebalance, and that's the convergence that we're seeing now. So Watt's steam engine, historians are right to say that what was so fundamental about the steam engine is that it broke the organic barrier of the traditional economy, because basically almost all energy of the primary energy of the pre-James Watt economy was organic. What you could feed to human beings for their labor and what you could feed to the animals for animal traction, plus a little bit of wind and a little bit of water. But basically an organic economy, and we moved to a fossil fuel economy, and that let loose the ability to do work of an unimaginable scale. So everything changed with the fossil fuel breakthrough in the last 2.5 centuries. And of course, Europe got there first, and Britain got there first of the first. And in the geopolitics, we ended up with the British world. This is a map of a wonderful book, The Countries Never Invaded by Britain. Those are the ones in white. Britain went out and just beat the shit out of everybody. And really nasty, by the way. Nasty. In 1839, showed up in China and saying, "You have to import our opium." "No, we don't want your opium. You don't want our opium? We'll beat the hell out of you." That was the first Opium War. It was followed by the second Opium War. No scruples at all. Sorry to say. So that's power. That's the power of one-sided industrialization. And it conquered much of the world. Long story, and I won't go into it, but the baton was passed to the younger Anglo-American kid brother in 1945, the great Anglo-Saxon handoff. and the US became the next empire. And the idea was that we would dot the world with 800 military bases around the world, and Henry Luce made the sweetest love song to American leaders, telling them this is the American century. That is always captivating. It was captivating to Genghis Khan, it was captivating to Lord Palmerston, and it has been captivating to American leaders since then also, to believe this is your century in the world. It's over, but we still have 800 military bases around the world. I believe the Ukraine war is likely to be America's Teutoburg Forest defeat. Teutoburg Forest was the loss by Augustus Octavian in AD 9, when the Roman Empire tried to cross the Rhine to the east to take over Germania and was defeated. It didn't end the Roman Empire, it just told them this is a limit and you're not going beyond that limit. And the United States is going to learn a limit that NATO doesn't just expand at US will. There are limits to that, and that's the painful process that we're in right now, but it's a secret, don't tell anyone outside. You're likely to be canceled if you do. So the world changed fundamentally after the Second World War. The United States aspired to be the world leader, but something else happened to bring Adam Smith's forecast to reality, and that was the end of the imperial age. If there is one dimension of imperialism that I think needs to be understood, it is that imperial powers do not educate the natives. And if there's one dimension of economic development that needs to be understood, it is that education is the absolute central feature of development. Because without education, nothing else can happen. And so the European imperial powers left the world illiterate, left their colonies basically illiterate. At the end of the colonial rule, the first thing that happened was mass education. We're still not there yet, but this is the most fundamental breakthrough that happened after World War II, the end of the colonial imperial era, and the United States does its empire in a different way through regime change operations, so it's not exactly the same as the occupation imperialism. But what countries got with their sovereignty was the ability to educate their people. And this has led to economic convergence. Just to show you the gaps, the peak of North Atlantic power was 1950 compared to the rest of the world. 56% of the literate world in 1950, roughly by my calculation, was in the North Atlantic region, meaning Western Europe, the United States, and Canada. Now it's 13% of the literate world. 60% of world output was in the North Atlantic region. Now it's 33% at purchasing power prices. 53% of all urban residents were in the North Atlantic world in 1950. Now it's 14%. The world's converged. Urban, literate, technologies have spread. Adam Smith was right that trade was actually the fundamental carrier of this. It was when China opened up that the acceleration of technological change came so fast to China. It was Japan that invented this process of rapid infusion of technology in the Meiji Restoration in 1868, and then again after World War II in its rebuilding. So we now see that Asia and the North Atlantic regions have crossed paths again using Madison's data updated by IMF data. The North Atlantic was the dominant power until this gap started to close in 1950. And by around 2010, Asia is now larger than the North Atlantic region. This is the real change of the world. We know that the BRICS, even before the recent expansion to 6 more countries, were already larger than the G7. That's a transformed world. And China, of course, overtook the US in GDP measured at purchasing power parity around 2014. But China is still much poorer per capita, maybe a third, but with more than 4 times the population. So this is the reason that China is a larger economy. So I want to argue very briefly that we're in a new age which I call the age of sustainable development. We're there in part because the scale of economic activity and a population 10 times the size of when Thomas Robert Malthus wrote The Principles of Population in 1798, which was then about 900 million people, and today 8 billion people, now has put so much pressure on the physical environment that we are in urgent need of global public response to climate, biodiversity destruction, loss of ecosystem functions, and so forth. And the world adopted goals addressed to this. It's fitfully trying to achieve them. Today at the UN, this very day, is the midpoint review of the Sustainable Development Goals. They're way off track, nice objectives not being achieved, mainly because the United States and other rich countries don't care at all about it. And so the world governance is not organized to achieve these goals at this point. But these goals are the real global goals and needs. So we have a very perilous moment because we have arrived at multipolarity. And as Adam Smith talked about, that balance of awe and equality of force to create justice, that's a delicate, difficult transformation. And just to say, there are several different theories of what's going on right now. Robert Kagan, whom you may know as our chief neocon ideologue and the husband of our acting Deputy Secretary of State, Victoria Nuland, believes that American hegemony must rule and will continue to rule. Otherwise, the jungle will grow back, as he says. Wow. Henry Kissinger says that we need a balance of power theory. Balance of power is okay, except it becomes imbalanced, and it's extremely difficult to manage. And when Bismarck was thrown out by Kaiser Wilhelm II, it was the end of Europe's balance of power, and World War I came in response when Bismarck's genius at balancing was lost. John Mearsheimer says we are inevitably in tragedy. That's just the nature of great power politics. Mearsheimer is extremely intelligent, predictive, an extremely nice person, but tragic to read because he says that conflict is inevitable. I don't buy it. Now, another theory that I read 50 years ago of a wonderful professor of mine also, Charles Kindleberger, said we need a hegemon. So if it's not the US or Britain, it's got to be someone else like China. I don't buy that either, but this is a brilliant book. Boy, it led to a lot of late night discussions over the next 50 years. Graham Allison says, as with Sparta and Athens, we're prone for war, not inevitable, but the war trigger is very high because of the rise of China. And my little contribution is, could we get our heads together and address global public goods and avoid global public bad? So I argue that we need a rational approach, not a tragic approach, and that it is not beyond us to reach the cooperative corner of the prisoner's dilemma. In other words, we can understand the game, we can understand the risks of defection, but we can understand the benefits of cooperation. And so we should be able to reach that cooperative outcome. So I would argue that we need a new geopolitics and a new ethics of sustainable development. I often refer to President Kennedy's inaugural address when he said, "The world is very different now, for man holds in his mortal hands the power to abolish all forms of human poverty and all forms of human life." So what hangs in the balance is something extraordinary. We could achieve SDG 1, end poverty, or we could blow up the world. And what is absolutely incredible is how this is in the hands of a very few people. That's what's incredible. And by the way, my takeaway from Oppenheimer was what a bunch of geniuses that invented the bomb and what a bunch of dolts who use it or decide about using it. This is our paradox. It took the greatest geniuses of the age to understand nuclear fission and how this could be created, and then it fell into the hands of the everyday person who might not have the imagination to keep us away from global disaster. That's technology, by the way. Technology is often created by geniuses and used by all of us. That is the real issue that Plato was wondering about already in the Republic 2,350 years ago. How do you make the rulers know what to do? He said you have to raise them from birth for that purpose. So there are crucial public goods at regional and global scale. This is something new. Regional scale, like the European Union or ASEAN or African Union, this is something new, how important this scale is. And global scale is almost unprecedented in human history. We had global trade, we had interconnectedness, but global public goods, not so much. Now we are with the center of global public goods, but institutions in the hands of nation states. Why? Weird. So I believe we need new kinds of global governance and ethics, and I think the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is a good place to start. We're in the 75th anniversary this year. And I believe that we can even find a common wisdom, which I call the ABCs of ancient wisdom, Aristotle, Buddha, and Confucius. They all, by the way, were virtue ethicists. They basically said, cultivate your soul as decent people. It said it in somewhat different ways, but they said it's virtue that gives us the capacity to reach the cooperative solution, whether it's civic virtue, friendship virtue, or the other virtues of sociality. And Aristotle said it's possible because we are zoon politikon, we are political animals. We can be sociable. And so I think finding this commonality of East and West is crucial now because there actually is a strong commonality of the underlying cultures. This was already pointed out in the observations of the axial age, that these philosophies arose roughly the same time and with roughly the same philosophical underpinnings. And I'll just end with President Kennedy's remarks 60 years ago. We're at the 60th anniversary of Kennedy's remarkable initiative to make peace at the height of the Cold War and to negotiate the partial nuclear test ban treaty, which was ratified just these days 60 years ago. Kennedy may well have been killed for it because rogue elements of the US government hated him for his peace initiatives, and I believe that this is probably what did him in. But he made wonderful observations about peace, and I'll just end with his most beautiful words. So let us not be blind to our differences, but let us also direct attention to our common interests and to the means by which those differences can be resolved. And if we cannot end now our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet, we all breathe the same air, we all cherish our children's future, and we are all mortal. Thank you very much. And if you do know the geography of power in the world, 15th and Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington is the Treasury, 16th and Pennsylvania Avenue is the White House, 17th and Pennsylvania is the Executive Office Building of the President, 18th and Pennsylvania is the World Bank, and 19th in Pennsylvania is the IMF. So that's how this was created.
I believe, because the IMF has, I love the place, by the way. I've been spending my whole life trying to help them put the finance minister on this side and work together with them. And I've trained a large number of the staff, and I tell them often, that's not what you learned in class. So I'm trying to help them do the right thing. But that's a power situation also, obviously. So to answer your question, first of all, there is no definitive answer to this. Second, so how big approximately? Somewhere between $3 and $5 trillion a year. Okay, now, is that a lot or a little? The world output is $100 trillion a year. The world saving is $30 trillion a year. So we're talking about 3 to 5% of world GDP. And we're talking about maybe, 10% to 16.6% of global saving. Perfectly manageable. And saving isn't fixed, it could rise and so forth. So the gaps are not huge. They are quite manageable, given that these are our major global goals. And certainly the gaps for the poorest countries are not at all big. Maybe $1 trillion a year. And $1 trillion a year is 1% of world output. And if you gave me $1 trillion a year, I would be able to help every government get out of poverty. That would be enough to make investments, get all the kids in school, get health care for every person, get water and electricity connection for every person. That'd be a great start. And you could do that for $1 trillion a year for all the billion people in extreme poverty. So it's not huge. So then comes lots of detailed, interesting analytical questions. First, some of it is for rich countries, but the gap there isn't really a financing gap, it's a political choice gap. They're just not making investments, but the finance is available. Where the gap is really most consequential is for countries that cannot mobilize this out of their domestic resources. A poor country cannot afford to get all its kids in school, by the way. This is very weird, because you'd think, well, at least you can do that. But I've spent 10 years on this calculation. And if you're a low-income country, it costs between 10 and 15% of GDP for universal primary and secondary education. Very high. The reason is teachers are relatively costly in low-income countries, and there are a lot of young kids in low-income countries because they have high fertility rates, so the whole age pyramid is very wide. So there's not an African country, low-income or lower middle-income country, that can actually afford SDG 4. And that should be the most alarming fact in the world, because you cannot have economic development without your kids educated. No matter what else you do, you cannot have economic development without educated kids. So it's for the low and lower middle income countries that the crisis is biggest. There are gaps in the high income countries, but I don't worry too much about them because those are political obstacles that should be filled, but it's manageable. Upper middle income is tricky because some upper middle income countries have good access to credit, others don't have access to credit. Then there's another consideration. Sorry, and I'll come to a conclusion. Technically, what do? There are two related issues. One, how could you make capital flow at relatively low cost and long-term maturity to poorer countries? This is the major technical question on finance. if you look at the penalties that low-income countries pay to borrow, they're quite steep. You pay 10 or 15% interest rates if you are a double B borrower, sub-investment grade, compared to what a triple A or double A minus borrower pays. And why is that? Long story, and I won't go into it, but making that flatter so that for poor countries they have access to low-cost capital is crucial. One way to do that is larger multilateral development banks. This is, everybody agrees on that, though they don't agree to do it, but they agree that that's one part of the solution. More ADB, more AIIB, more new development bank, more World Bank. That requires capital increases. Capital increases mean larger voting shares for China. The United States needs to swallow, and Europe needs to swallow and get on with it. So that's one part of what needs to be done. The second part is to de-risk private capital flows. That's also a tricky set of issues. I'd say I got into that question 45 years ago as a graduate student, and it's still somewhat of a puzzle. It's a long story, but it's not impossible to do that. There's one more dimension, and because also you're from the Russian Federation, I want to mention it, and that is that there's an intrinsic link between global finance and global monetary arrangements. And global monetary arrangements mean how we settle trade. And we are, of course, in a largely dollar-based settlements system. So the monetary system is largely dollar-based, not exclusively, but about 60%. And the United States, unfortunately and unwisely, weaponized the dollar-based payment system starting about 15 years ago by seizing assets, including Russian assets recently, the $300 billion seized in 2022, but also Iran, North Korea, Afghanistan, Venezuela, and a number of others. To my mind, this is a completely unacceptable and self-defeating policy. It's cheap because the President of the United States can do it with a stroke of the pen. You don't have to ask Congress, you don't have to ask the public, you don't have to ask the UN, you don't have to ask anybody. To my mind, it's blatantly illegal and absolutely practically unwise. Because why would you use dollars if the US is going to take them away from you when they don't like what you're doing? The idea of payments is that they're reliable, not that they're political. So this is why the BRICS countries, especially under Russia's leadership this year, are negotiating non-dollar payments. And I support this entirely. But I also say to the US Treasury all the time, don't confiscate other people's money. It's not a good policy. It's not going to work. And the idea, by the way, of grabbing Russia's $300 billion for Ukraine is so illegal you don't even know where to start. But these are politicians. They're not lawyers. They're not diplomats. They're not financiers. They want quick solutions for their re-elections. So this is really a problem. But it's a problem that also has a solution because we just won't use the dollar in places where the United States policies could lead to confiscation. So all of this means we have a bit of a morass in the international financial system within our family of getting the right answers to the financing questions. There's actually one more technical point I need to mention, which is that the IMF and the World Bank have what they call the Debt Sustainability Framework, or DSF. And it's based on an arbitrary set of numbers where they say, we grade you whether you're weak, medium, or strong in debt management. And then based on your ranking, we give you a ceiling of gross debt to GDP. And the ceiling is no more than 30% debt to GDP ratio if you are a weakly governed country. This is a death certificate. This is not economic policy. Why? Because if you're a poor country, it means almost by definition you don't have electricity, you don't have paved roads, you don't have digital access, and your kids aren't in school. So what the IMF and the World Bank are telling you is stay that way. Don't bother us. Don't borrow because you might get into debt trouble. But if you don't borrow, you won't have electricity, schools, or anything else. They don't have an alternative solution for these countries. So they're telling the countries, don't borrow. I'm telling the countries, borrow. But my advice is borrow 30-year maturity, fixed interest rates, and on reasonable terms. But where do you get those? That's where I want the G20 to come into this story, to give an answer to that. But when I do, again, in my spare time, solving a growth model for how much you should borrow if you want to have your kids in school, have electricity, and so on, exactly your question, the debt actually rises to about 200% of GDP before it starts declining 30 years from now. You want to borrow a lot because you don't want to live without electricity, you don't want to live without roads, you don't want to live without educated children, you don't want to live without health facilities. So you want to borrow, but you want the borrowing to be very long-term so that you have 40 years to grow in order to repay the debt 40 years from now. The IMF has none of this intertemporal analysis because the debt sustainability framework is a 5-year snapshot. It's not a growth scenario. Now, I taught intertemporal growth for 30 years, and this is where I tell my students, you learn something, right? You borrow if the rate of return on your investment is higher than the cost of capital, and if you're not going to get into a debt crisis in the meantime. So we need to create a finance framework that can work. Final words. For this region, SCAP, there are a few countries that are seriously debt constrained or finance constrained. Most are not, but some are. For Africa, it's pervasive. The whole continent is debt constrained right now. So that's where the most serious problems are. Within this region, you have the means to solve the problem because this is a high saving region. And China has a saving surplus. That's why initiatives like the Belt and Road Initiative are wonderful. And they should really be encouraged. But the advice I give to China is when you lend for the Belt and Road Initiative, lend for 30 years. Don't lend for 10 years or 12 years. You will be disappointed and your counterpart will be very disappointed because they'll get into debt crisis. And that's what's happening right now. Not that China set a debt trap, that's propaganda. China didn't set a debt trap, it just set a maturity structure too short. And so when I speak to the Chinese finance authorities, I'm telling them 30-year loans. And nobody thinks ahead more than China. So China needs to do the same thing of looking at a 30-year perspective, and especially for the poorer countries, give much longer term loans. And for the rest of the US, unfortunately, is not a net savings surplus country, it's a net debtor country, so it can't offer much in finance anymore. But the capital markets could offer more, and we need to tap that. Sorry for the long-winded answer, but good, very good question, important question.
In a press conference a year ago,
we didn't really mean it. It just gave time for Ukraine to strengthen its defenses and so forth. Well, this is very cynical and very destructive. But the reason I mention it is Russia was not calling for Ukrainian territory, except we raised the stakes in this poker game. And then Russia said, okay, we'll take Crimea. And the United States said, and we want autonomy for the Russian regions. No, we raised the stakes, no autonomy. And then Russia said at the end of 1991, look, this situation is not controlled. Minsk is not being enforced. NATO is still intending to enlarge to Ukraine. This is the last chance. We demand negotiations with the United States. And President Putin put on the table a draft agreement with the US on December 17, 2021. And the United States said, no, we're not negotiating any of that with you. That's arrogance. They did it again. I called the White House at the end of 2021 and spoke with senior official and said, negotiate with Russia, avoid the war. Oh, don't worry, Professor Sachs. Of course, the United States rejected negotiations and the special military operation started. Now, this is also very interesting. At the time of the special military operation, the two regions, Lugansk and Donetsk, claimed independence. Russia did not annex them until September 2022. They claimed independence. Of course, the United States said no, but immediately Zelensky said, okay, we can negotiate with Russia. And in March 2022, there were negotiations, and they were actually going to reach an outcome of Ukrainian neutrality and an end to the war. And then what happened? The United States stepped in and said, no, don't do that. We don't accept that. Well, how stupid is that? You have a losing hand, but they raised the ante one more time. Now, why did they do that? Because they're basically ignorant. In this case, they didn't understand how bad their hand was. They looked at their cards and they said, we're going to impose economic sanctions, and this will bring Russia to its knees. And we will ship HIMARS missiles, and this will destroy the Russian military. This is a fantasy world of these people, these neocons in Washington. So they raised the stakes one more time. They said no to a negotiated peace. They said no to Ukrainian neutrality. And the war continued. And now where are we in this advanced stage of the war? Russia is absolutely destroying one Ukrainian army after another. This is obvious. And the much talked about Ukrainian counteroffensive that was supposed to take place in June 2023 and reach the Sea of Azov. Of course, it didn't reach anything. It didn't do anything other than kill tens of thousands of Ukrainians and cost an unbelievable amount of money in destroyed tanks, weapon systems, artillery, everything. So it's been a disaster. These are the worst poker players I've ever seen. All they do with a lousy hand is keep raising the stakes and keep losing.
Maybe now they are trying to shift focus, shift attention to Gaza or maybe to some other conflicts, because actually when you are losing in one, then you can try to induce more chaos.
You asked me a question which I didn't answer. I gave a long answer.
If there is a way out.
No, but you asked me a question, what to do. And the point I would make is the first thing we should do is stop raising the ante, Stop saying, oh, we're going to defeat them. It's easy. We're going to beat them. No, Ukraine's not going to defeat Russia. And the more that this goes on, the more dead Ukrainians there are. That's just the most basic point. And the whole society has been so profoundly wounded because millions and millions of Ukrainians are in Europe or are in Russia, and hundreds of thousands are dead because of this. So the population has collapsed, and there aren't young people anymore. Now they want to draft kids and young women because they've run out of soldiers. It's terrible. And so we need to stop raising the ante. Now, what would that mean? We need to negotiate. We need to say first, okay, NATO is not enlarging, but Russia, you have to stop taking more and more Ukraine. And what the Russians are going to say at this point is, okay, we keep the following territories. And we're going to have to negotiate over that, because the idea that, no, we don't make any concessions, you're just going to be defeated, is going to end up destroying all of Ukraine. It's raising the stakes on a lousy hand. And we should recognize that we are going to need a political outcome right now, not the one we wanted, but we were so dumb not to take a better deal a year ago, 2 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, that now we're in a situation where we're not going to get exactly what we, quote, want. But to continue the fighting would absolutely destroy even more.
What worries me most is actually that really the lives of Ukrainians are just taken as a casualty, as something not even worth speaking about.
They don't even talk about it. The leadership is absolutely gross. You know, I'm sure that Zelensky is in a very hard place, but all he talks about right now is throwing more lives to the graves. Frankly, no strategy, no self-awareness, no situational awareness. Okay, it's very sad because the United States talked him out of a peace agreement in March 2022. That was Zelensky's chance, and he lost it. He was inexperienced. You know, when the United States comes and tells you, we have your back, you tend to believe it if you're inexperienced. I tried to tell him, by the way, I really tried to tell the Ukrainians, look, I'm an old guy. I've been through lots of U.S. wars, Vietnam War, Nicaragua, the Gulf Wars, Syria. They never win. Are you kidding? Do you really want to end up like Afghanistan? And they didn't believe me. They just thought, oh, you're a Putin apologist. So they didn't want to hear any of this. But I was telling them the hard facts about American wars, and they didn't want to hear it.
Besides Russia, I'm not sure that Ukraine actually is such a big topic in American policy. I'm not sure about that.
Yeah, it's
maybe
definitely
Israel.
You know, it's a big focus of the political class still, the military-industrial complex and the White House. Maybe for just political reasons that Biden doesn't want to admit what a lousy poker player he is. But the point is, for the American people, they've had enough. There's no groundswell of support. People don't want that. They want to stop this thing. And so in that sense, you're absolutely right. Typically, the public doesn't have much say in this. We have almost no public debate. But Biden's popularity is really collapsing. And the unhappiness with Biden's foreign policy is very, very clear. So maybe even public opinion is going to start playing a role because we're now in an election year.
I would like to ask you to clear the position on China, because when I look both at the Republicans or at the Democrats, I would say that their views on China are very similar. So they actually have very hostile views towards China. Now there was a summit, APEC, where both presidents, Biden and Xi Jinping, met. Do you see any decline in tension, any hopes that actually the relations, they're probably not going to be friendly, but let's say at least stabilize and would be less threatening for the world?
I'll tell you an interesting thing. When President Xi came to this APEC summit in San Francisco, he met 200 U.S. business leaders, and they gave him a standing ovation. I don't think they would give an American president a standing ovation, but they gave President Xi a standing ovation. Why? China's their biggest market. They both produce in China, they sell in China, they make a lot of money in China, and they want normal relations. What is happening is two things. One, we have a kind of security class in America who are all about American dominance, American hegemony, America being number one. It's a very strange group of people, but this is our foreign policy establishment. Then we have politicians who basically think that, and it's very particular, Trump in 2016 won the election by winning swing states in the middle of America, in the American Midwest, which is our industrial zone. And he won it by saying, China took your jobs away. And when he made narrow victories in those states, the Democrats said, oh, we have to attack China in order to compete politically with Trump. So there are two reasons for the anti-China sentiment in the United States. One, and in the political class, one is this idea of America being the only dominant country. Well, I mean, unless you're playing a board game like the game of Risk, you don't get to be the dominant country in the world when there are other big countries around. So this is arrogance, again, very misguided. Then there is this protectionist politics, which tries to appeal to a few swing states in the US elections. The upshot of this is that the political class, both Democrats and Republicans, are pretty united against China, pretty ignorant from my experience. They don't know China, they don't know Chinese history, they don't have any perspective. They play a dangerous game, like when our Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, flew to Taiwan. So stupid. Sorry. Just why do you want to provoke another superpower?
Thank you for saying that, because we have the same representatives who are also provoking China in this kind.
Okay, don't provoke China. Be respectful. Just have normal relations. Don't provoke a superpower. Why? What is in it to poke a superpower? It's stupid. People should think. If there's even if you think there's a bully, which China's not, but if you think there's a bully in the schoolyard and you're a little kid and you think they're the bully, is it really smart to go poking them and say, you're a bully, I hate you? No, you're going to get hurt in the end. So you need some common sense. And China's not even bullying. China is just big, successful, dynamic, actually a good trade partner for Europe. So we should treat it normally, respectfully. And the U.S. anxieties should not be Europe's anxieties. This is another area where European politicians are just repeating the words of American politicians. And I know behind the scenes, although it's obvious, why does van der Leyen repeat words almost like Biden? Because she feels that her job is to be with the United States. Maybe she hopes the United States appoints her as the Secretary General of NATO or something. I don't know what it is. No, but that's what she hopes maybe. So this is where Europe makes a big mistake. Just like it did make a big mistake in Ukraine, it would make a big mistake of trying to make an enemy out of China. That's a completely ridiculous losing proposition.
My last question, because our time is coming up, I have to reflect one very current event you already mentioned, and that's the elections in Argentina.
Yes.
Because let's say that the elected president is unusual personality. How do you view this situation? Is there a danger for BRICS or maybe for other Latin American countries with his very strange suggestions as for foreign policy, as for economics?
Yeah, of course, time will tell. One thing is he won the presidency, but has no control over the Congress. His small parties, and at least for the moment, doesn't have any kind of governing coalition in the Congress. So maybe his ability to do things will require a much broader coalition of forces, and that could be a constraint. But let me just say first, Argentina is a country that has been unstable for its whole history, going back to the 1820s, ever since independence. Argentina has messed up more currencies, had more inflation and more instability than any other place on the entire planet. This guy won not because of what he says, but because of disgust with the outgoing government, which was delivering inflation of triple digits, more than 100%. You can't really win an election when inflation is triple digit. And I know Argentina quite well, and actually worked with the finance minister just before this one. And he was doing a good job, and he ended up being not forced out. He resigned, unfortunately. But he resigned because his own, I would say, corrupt politicians in his own party were rejecting the normal policies that he was trying to promote. So Argentina is now in yet another cycle of instability. All my professional career as an economist, I've been watching Argentina in amazement, because it's not an impoverished country by any means, and it's got huge natural wealth and very smart people, well-educated class of people, but it has made such a political mess repeatedly, and this could be yet another one. I don't want to say on the first day after the election of this guy that he'll really govern the way he campaigned, because sometimes they become a lot more responsible, but it could be that that he is what he says he is, in which case Argentina is going to face some real troubles. It's regrettable, because I'm a fan of the BRICS. I would like to see them work. Argentina is a new member of the BRICS group. Whether this guy stays in or out of the BRICS or gets kicked out of the BRICS, everything remains to be seen. But I only hope that this guy was making this as a persona, not as a real politics, because his real politics, if delivered this way, would be very, very detrimental to Argentina. For companies and rich individuals. So that is the second thing that happened. The third thing that happened is that the environmental crises, especially the climate change crisis, came and would require changes in our behavior, and would also cause limitations to the big energy industry, the oil, the gas, the coal industry. And the industry resisted those changes, said no. And the politicians said, oh, it's not even real. Like Václav Klaus and others, they just denied the climate change. And this denial has gone on for decades. Actually, we just saw a new president of Argentina elected just now, who said that climate change is a socialist plot. You can't even make this up. I don't know whether this is just playing games to get elected, whether it's complete sheer ignorance, whether it's corruption. I don't know what it is, but it's shocking. People in any kind of responsibility should know better. They should at least understand what this issue is about. And this has been a very big challenge. It's, again, part of the arrogance. I happen to lead a scientific institute at Columbia University with hundreds of climate scientists. So I had an earful all the time about the climate science. Many people don't have that chance to hear directly. So they hear from politicians or actors who want to be politicians, who say whatever they feel like. And the result is that we go decade after decade without solving these problems, despite all the meetings, the treaties, the conferences, and so forth. So when you add all of this up, as I said, I think the underlying problem is arrogance of the rich and the powerful, who somehow think the rules don't apply to them. And we end up in a world that is in conflict. We end up in a world that is divided between rich and poor. We end up in a world that is facing massive environmental crises. And it's all so weird because the world's richer than ever before, better technologies than ever before. And we could, if we chose right, move to peace immediately. I just testified in the UN Security Council about 4 wars: the war in Ukraine, the war in Israel and Palestine, the war in Syria, and the war in the Sahel of Africa, which is Burkina, Mali, Chad, Niger. And I pointed out all 4 of these huge wars could be stopped tomorrow with politics, with basic sound politics. But our leaders are just incapable of basic sound politics, unfortunately.
When you mentioned arrogance and the beginning of the 90s, well, I am from the Czech Republic, as you know, myself. So,
of course.
Yes, we have vast experience with neoliberal policies and their application. However, I wanted to ask about liberal democracy. Of course, we have to mention Francis Fukuyama and his end of history. And now we see how completely wrong that was. But do you see also the liberal democracy as something that maybe hides more the true state of affairs than actually helps to resolve the conflicts? Because, when scholars like Martin Wolf suggest that maybe instead of voting, we should have some, choice by chance randomly, it would be better than elect the representatives that we have. There's certainly something wrong. So maybe if you could elaborate on the liberal democracy, and maybe it really will be an end, but the question is what kind of end it will be.
It would be great if we could make democracy work, because democracy is very attractive in principle. It's a way for free people to express themselves. It's a way for people to participate. It's a way for people to learn about social and political realities. So it, in principle, is a very attractive system. And in general, it's a way for people to have protection from their own governments, because non-democratic governments can be very, very destructive of their own people because there's no control necessarily over government. So in principle, I'm a Democrat, but in practice, you can see all of the difficulties of making this work. A democracy needs to have an informed public. A democracy needs to have a respectful dialogue or deliberation in the public, not shouting, not even worse, violence, not hidden influence. A democracy needs to prevent being taken over by powerful interests that use the democracy as a facade, as a pretense rather than real democracy. So some democracies work pretty well. Some in Europe work reasonably well. I would say the quality of the American democracy has declined tremendously during my lifetime. Maybe that's an illusion, but I feel that, and I can see even in the data that people had more confidence in government 60 years ago than they have today. And I look at that, and I've, of course, spent my whole life trying to understand that declining confidence in our government. And I find two factors that are at the core of this. One is that after World War II, the United States created a security state with the CIA and other institutions that were supposedly ensuring national security. But in fact, they really diminished democracy, because the first principle of the CIA is that it's secret and its actions are secret. And it does lots of things around the world that are not good, but they're secret. So this really undermined American democracy. And we don't have much public effect on foreign policy, for example, in the United States, because when it comes to foreign policy, really the president and a few other people make decisions on behalf of everybody without public debate or without control by any really democratic institutions, other than a vote once every few years. But that's not enough, because we go to war all the time against the interests of the American people. So that's one part of the problem. The other part of the problem that I mentioned earlier is the big money in politics. Some countries restrict private campaign financing. In fact, most in Europe don't have a lot of corruption of the political system. But the United States, I regard as kind of legal corruption, legal in the sense that our Supreme Court said that companies can spend whatever they want on politics, no restriction, or few restrictions. And the result is our election cycle, say the 2024 election, will spend maybe $15 billion of campaign financing. Now, you don't get honest government with so much money changing hands. You get government that is purchased by the highest bidder. And this is why the confidence in democracy has declined so much.
You mentioned, of course, the power of big money. I wouldn't be so optimistic about the situation in Europe. I just believe because the economies are weaker, then there's not so much money as in the US, but the tendency is practically the same. You mentioned Joe Biden and, of course, then President Trump. Probably they'll meet in elections next year, probably. Do you see the crisis in leadership? Because when we look in the past, we see many strong leaders who were both from Europe, from the United States, who were able to offer some vision and lead a society, some of them even towards a peaceful society. We mentioned Willy Brandt, Olof Palme. We can also mention Ronald Reagan as a special type of American heritage as well. I would say there is a certain decline in these leadership qualities. Do you view it as well? Because in Europe, it's, I think, very visible.
Yes, I think the quality of the political leadership in the US and Europe is very weak right now in general. Speaking of the United States, we have two leading candidates, one of whom is 81 and can't find his way off the stage anymore. He happens to be our president. And the other one is a convicted, is multiply convicted, psychologically unstable person who now faces dozens of criminal counts right now in trials coming up. So maybe we'll have an octogenarian who should never be running, and a convicted felon running for the presidency. This is a terrible, terrible thing, obviously. How can we get there? There are some other candidates. I'm hoping that Robert Kennedy Jr. Proves himself as a highly capable candidate, and I like him. We were schoolmates, we're friends, and he comes from a great political tradition. In fact, his uncle, John F. Kennedy, was, in my view, the last great American president, because after that, well, we had some very nice and smart people, a few, not very many. Jimmy Carter was one. But we've had a lot of failed presidents and failed presidencies. So the quality of leadership is quite low. And in Europe, it's also really surprising to me how, when the United States makes such bad judgments, European leaders tend to follow along the US lead. And of course, I'm very unhappy about the Ukraine war. I mean, everyone's unhappy about it, but I have a view that's somewhat different from the mainstream view, which is, in my interpretation, the war in Ukraine was caused by the US wanting to expand NATO. And of course, many in Europe say, no, it's all Putin. He did this. But I know enough history, and I was present at enough events to know how much the US provoked this war through absolutely stupid policies. Because if you're smart, you don't push a military alliance right up against Russia's border. That's just not a wise thing to do. Russia's extremely sensitive to the military of the West encroaching on it because of how many times Russia's been invaded by the West. And especially when the United States politicians have so much hostility to Russia, which they do. They openly express the idea that Russia should be dismantled and many other things. Of course, Russia's going to see NATO expansion as a direct threat to national security, and it's not going to let it happen. So this is just an example of terrible policy, predictable disaster. But the US went along with it. Now, my point was, the Europeans knew better. I know, because many Europeans told me many times, NATO expansion to Ukraine is very dangerous. But then they don't say it in public. And they don't say it in public because the United States would get mad at them. And, they're afraid of the US. They shouldn't be afraid of the US. Europe should have its own independent foreign policy, and it should understand its own interests. And the interests are not just following along the United States. So this is just a very important example of the weakness of the political leadership right now in Europe as well as in the United States.
Yeah, we see that here very well. So they're actually not able even to formulate the national interests. And I don't know if it's fear or simply they are not capable to understand what's going on. Maybe it's a combination of both. However, the consequences are really disastrous for the EU, both economically and politically, of course. You mentioned
one European political leader said to me a couple of years ago, they don't take us seriously in Washington. And he said it even more colorfully, which I won't repeat exactly, but this was a leader of a major country. And my thought was, Yeah, but you should not allow yourself to be treated that way. That's your fault. That's not America's fault. Yes, America's arrogant, but stand up for Europe. And this should be the approach, but it's not the approach.
Argentina, endlessly fascinating, a little bit bizarre. Hopefully they'll get out of it this time. What's interesting now geopolitically is that the outgoing government had joined the BRICS. And that is a good thing and an important thing for Argentina, because it brings Argentina and the next door giant Brazil together, which is very good for South America, very important diplomatically, very important geopolitically. The incoming government has said, oh, we don't want to have anything to do with China because Milei is being portrayed as an ardent Americanist. So on the American side of this bloc politics, my message to the Argentines is, look, China's your major customer. Don't be dumb. Don't go with the U.S. in this sense. Trade with the U.S., trade with China. Don't get into this crazy mentality of one side or another. And by the way, in this world today, if you have to choose one side or another, I wouldn't go with the American side. Every time a country sides with the United States these days, it ends up in disaster, like Ukraine, because the U.S. is a fading empire. It can't sustain all its promises, not even close. It can't even keep its own public institutions functioning anymore. So my message to the Argentines is, you don't have to choose sides. Just be nice, but don't break relations with China, for heaven's sake. Join the BRICS. It's a good thing to do. And maybe within the BRICS efforts this year, which are very important efforts to create non-dollar payments, there'll be something in it for Argentina. That I'm going to try to explain to them. There really is some good news for Argentina in the fact that it won't just be the dollar in the world, that there will be alternative payments, and Argentina shouldn't close itself off from what's going to be an important new force in international monetary economics.
That's all very interesting, because one of the things that I noticed, which has not been mentioned, I think, widely, is that Putin, of course, has just been to the UAE and he's just been to the Saudi Arabia, and he came with a very, very big and very strong delegation of people. And I noticed that one of the people who was there was, of course, Nabulina, who is the central bank chair. And both Saudi Arabia,
I didn't realize she was on the trip, but that is a very interesting part.
It was interesting because I don't think it was announced, but there was a list of, you saw the picture of all the people in Riyadh, and they were all shaking hands. And one of the people who was there and who shook their hands was none other than Nabulina. So she was there. And of course, Saudi Arabia and the UAE are both joining the BRICS in a few weeks. So is Iran. The Iranian president has just been to Moscow. He's had discussions there with Putin. There's just been this announcement of this free trade agreement. And then at the same time, Putin gave this speech at an investment forum run by VTB. And a disproportionate amount of that discussion was about the financial architecture. He was saying that, in fact, that seemed to be the most important thing, that, you need to get the financial architecture right domestically in order to move forward. But he was also talking about the new financial architecture. And he said some very interesting things about how the existing financial architecture, which is Western-based, is becoming outdated and obsolescent, also in a technological sense. So you have Nabulina there in all of these meetings, and she's presumably talking about all of these matters. She seems to be very interested in them. And she's talking with the big oil producers. And Iran is also a big oil producer. And at the same time, you have all these discussions from Putin about financial systems. And I wonder whether this adds up.
Yeah, the trip was absolutely fascinating, incredibly skillful of Putin.
at this moment. And it reflects actually three major geopolitical points, all, I think, rather ingeniously brought together. One of them is OPEC plus, of course. OPEC plus Russia constitutes an enormous part of the hydrocarbons market of the world, and they do a lot of important business together in this, in managing the oil and gas market. So that's one part of the trip. Another part of the trip is clearly regional, which is the integration of Russia with Central Asia, with the Arabian Peninsula, with the Middle East more generally. And you look at the map, and between Russia, China, Central Asia, Arabia, this is building, and of course, India is a member of the BRICS. This is really building most of Eurasia into an integrated geopolitical and economic huge part of the world. And so very, very deft in that regard also. A basic principle of economics, a fundamental principle, is neighbors should get along. They trade well with each other. They share ecosystems with each other. And that's the principle that Putin is following because Iran is a neighbor. The Middle East is a neighbor. This is very smart. And then the third dimension, in addition to the oil and the neighborhood, is, of course, the BRICS. And the BRICS started out as the five: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. It had already reached an output level measured at what we call purchasing power prices, or at international prices, larger than the G7. That is geopolitically and economically notable. But now the five are being joined by six more, presumably. Argentina, that's the new addition in South America. Egypt and Ethiopia in Africa, and Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, and Iran in the Middle East region. Now, you add the six to the original five, you have 37% of world output, according to the IMF purchasing power data, compared to 29 to 30% for the G7. This is a different world, and this is really powerful. And what the BRICS are discussing this year in particular is exactly this financial architecture. And of course, that was greatly hastened by the absolutely awful and mistaken US policies on the dollar. So the US has what Charles de Gaulle, already President de Gaulle, 50 years ago, 60 years ago, called the exorbitant privilege, which is that the dollar is used for about 60% of international transactions of all kinds. The way you denominate a contract, the way you pay to settle a contract, the way governments hold their foreign exchange reserves. So on all three major dimensions of international currency, the dollar predominates. Not exclusively, but overwhelming. And that gives the US a huge advantage. You don't run out of the dollar to what? To the dollar. And so it's not like Argentina, where everyone's sitting on the edge as the US debt reaches 100% of GDP. If Argentine debt ever came close to 100% of GDP, they'd be out the door in a moment. But with the US being the currency of the world, nobody flees the dollar. So that's the exorbitant privilege, that you get to borrow, you can pump up the money supply, you get some inflation, but you don't get what Argentina or just about any other emerging economy would get. But the US just couldn't leave good enough alone. It had to weaponize the dollar. And this has really been, it's become an addiction. The US generally is addicted to regime change. The US generally is addicted to a foreign policy that says, I don't like you, I want to replace you. Send in the CIA or send in an army, but we get to choose who your government is. Now, this is absolutely disastrous foreign policy, in my view, completely against the UN Charter, completely against international law, but that's the core. And the US figured out 10 or 15 years ago that it could use the dollar as a foreign policy weapon. And the main way that it uses it is in a very crude way, which is to say, one day, your dollars are now our dollars. Thank you. Your dollars literally means you have accounts in US banks or US controlled banks. That's what a dollar is in effect, M2 definition of a dollar. So you're holding dollar accounts in institutions that we control. And what the US has come to do increasingly frequently is freeze the money of other countries, of their central banks, no less, of their state enterprises. And the United States did this with Venezuela. Absolutely absurd, but one day Trump and his minions got the idea that they will declare who's the real president of Venezuela, not the actual president of Venezuela, but they named someone from the Venezuelan parliament as president and said, okay, that guy's president. That actually lasted for a few years. And you could see the power of the United States. It's like the emperor with no clothes. About 40 countries said, now Mr. Guaido is president, not Mr. Maduro, who's actually president. So you could see a measure of the US influence that other countries would follow this nonsense. But in the process, they said, Mr. Maduro's no longer president, because we said so, and he no longer has access to the foreign exchange reserves of the country. We give that to this other one. Well, this is absolutely crazy. Even the IMF couldn't, I shouldn't say even the IMF couldn't figure this out. It doesn't have the gumption to say to the United States, that's ridiculous. So, no, we have a big issue. Who really controls the foreign exchange reserve? So these games went on for years. Of course, with Russia, it's much more serious than that. The United States froze its estimated $300 billion of Russian financial assets. That's a lot of money, by the way. That was the trick that was going to bring Russia to its knees. It didn't do so, but that's what they thought. We've got Putin cornered. We've got Russia cornered. We'll bring them to their knees by freezing their assets and locking them out of the US banking system, the so-called SWIFT settlement system. Well, Russia quickly figured out, very cleverly, we could trade with China and renminbi. We could trade with India and rupees. Little bit shakier on that front. We can find other ways to transact. And to make maybe a short story long as I have, this year Russia is the leader of the BRICS. The BRICS summit will be in Kazan next October, I believe it is. And so Russia chairs the process, and it's chairing an expert group to come up with non-dollar payments. This is smart. And I kept telling my friends in the US government, don't abuse the dollar. It's going to go away. Because in monetary economics, the first thing you teach is the real economy is the real thing, what you produce, what the factories are. There are many ways to make a settlement, even barter, of course, but there are many currencies you can use. So don't think that your currency brings another country to its knees, because the other country's economy is the real economy. The ability to produce steel, the ability to produce weapons or artillery, the ability to produce automobiles or chips or whatever it is, or oil. And the United States misunderstood that, but really abused the privilege of the dollar. And the dollar will absolutely lose its role in centrality in the international payment system in the coming decade. In monetary economics, just to mention, all my colleagues look at history and say it's a long, slow decline of a currency. And the most famous case is the British pound, which used to be the core of the international monetary and financial system in the 19th century until basically the Great Depression. But the fact is, and so they say, look, the pound hung in there even after Germany was larger, even after the United States was larger, even after Britain's share of the world economy had declined. London remained the center of the international system. But it's not going to happen the same way with the dollar because it's just too easy technologically to do things differently. And so we will have at least an international renminbi at a minimum playing a big role. And we could have a kind of BRICS, if not central bank, a BRICS monetary fund that serves the role of giving liquidity and credits among the BRICS countries in a way which will mean a non-dollar settlement system.
Professor Sachs, just a few things. As a person in Britain, I can say that the long decline of sterling after Britain lost its hegemonic position in the world economy was an absolute disaster for Britain. You would not want to go through that process again.
And by the way, it's quite interesting just to say the way it manifested. Of course, World War I was awful. The return to gold in 1926 overvalued Britain in the world economy. And Keynes wrote one of his most famous essays in 1926 called The Economic Consequences of Mr. Churchill, who happened to be the Chancellor of the Exchequer in 1926 that put this mistake into place. The 1930s were the Great Depression. World War II, of course, devastating. And the point is, by the end of World War II, Britain had basically gone deeply into debt, even with its own colonies, which became independent countries. And so Britain never quite got out of debtor status again. And it was a very, very heavy, long, painful period. Britain, the center of the world, going to the new International Monetary Fund for an emergency loan. I mean, unthinkable. But, the United States, can you imagine going to the IMF for a loan? It's not impossible. This is exactly what you're referring to.
Absolutely. I remember it. I was in London, of course, when it happened. I can remember the Chancellor turning back at the airport. He had to rush off to Washington to raise funds. And, of course, the fact that we had this currency, which was still an international currency, was doing immense damage to the British domestic economy, which I think people don't understand. So in some ways, it might actually be better for the United States, I would have thought, to go through it quickly than have it, drawn out in the way that it was with Britain. I'm not, by the way, saying that's going to happen, and I'm not making those points. But anyway, that's what I wanted to say. If it's a long process, it's a long agony. It's not based on the British experience.
So, we will have non-dollar payments in the BRICS. That's clearly high on the mind, not only of President Putin, obviously, but also President Lula, who every day asks, and he's the chair of the G20 this year, as well as being a BRICS member. Why are we dealing with Russia in dollars, for heaven's sake? And he's very sensible, very logical. And we will move to new payments arrangements, and they will do just fine, thank you. That will be the real lesson. And opening up the space for a completely different kind of international finance. I'll give you an example. The U.S. was the creator of the World Bank, but now the U.S. Congress won't put new money into the World Bank. And because of that, the World Bank's actually a quite small institution. It's got a big name, but it's a quite small institution in the financial scheme of things. The U.S. won't put more money in. The Congress says, no, why should we waste our money internationally and so forth? And you get a lot of hubbub about that. So China and the rest of the BRICS say, okay, we'll make our own development bank. And they established the new development bank, or sometimes called the BRICS Bank, based in Shanghai. And that's just one of the institutions that is really changing the scene. There's the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, AIIB, based in Beijing, in fact. There is, as President Lula said, and it's happening also in the context of the Ukraine war, a move away from the use of the dollar, which the United States has thought, well, that's our ace in the hole. You know, that is our ultimate hold on things because we can use sanctions, we can use our financial control to keep other countries in line. But other countries are saying, not so much. We'll trade in renminbi. We'll trade in rubles. We'll trade in rupees. We'll trade in our own national currencies. And they're quickly setting up alternative institutions to do this. The United States doubles down. We will confiscate your reserves. We will, if you don't follow. And the other countries are saying, you know, if you want to go through the UN and get really multilateral rules, we're with you. But if you want to just impose the rules, we won't follow along. And so we have this very funny expression called a rule-based international order. The United States government uses it every day. But what does it mean? Who writes the rules? And what most of the world wants, in fact, is rules written in a multipolar or multilateral setting, not rules written by the United States and a few friends and allies.
I wanted to ask you, you've been an advisor to the United Nations for quite often. The issue of how much longer the permanent members of the Security Council can keep the number to 5, because clearly Brazil and other countries of the global south have been saying the UN needs to be reformed. And countries from Latin America, specifically Brazil and Africa, should have representation on the UN Security Council, permanent members.
Yes, you know, the P5, the permanent 5, which is the United States, China, Russia, France, and the United Kingdom, was the World War II victor group in 1945. They wrote into the rules of the UN, incidentally, that they would be the permanent Security Council members and have a veto over any change in the UN Charter. So it's really a group that gave itself power that the other 188 countries of the world look on and say, what is this? We need change. I would say the country that is most amazed and frustrated by this, in fact, is India. India is now the most populous country in the world. The United States has 335 million, roughly, in the population. Britain, France, roughly 60 million. India, 1.4 billion, not on the Security Council, a nuclear power, a world superpower, the president of the G20 this year, really not happy about that. Brazil, the largest economy of South America, similarly not on the Security Council. So this has been an issue for more than 20 years. The P5 in various ways have blocked particular countries, but added up, the P5 have said, you know what, this is our club. We want to stay as the permanent 5. But I think as we really face the reality of it's not just a post-US dominated world, but actually a post-Western dominated world, because it was the US as the dominant power among the so-called West, which means the US, Britain, European Union, and honorary Western membership, Japan, let's say. But we're post-Western as well as post-US in dominance. And these international institutions will need to change, or they won't function in the 21st century. And if they don't function, it's actually a disaster for us. If they didn't exist, we'd have to make them because we need them to function. So we also need to renovate them.
I wanted to talk about China negotiating these various agreements. Let's turn to Brazil's President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, speaking before his meeting with Chinese President Xi Jinping.
O que o Putin quer? O Putin não pode ficar com terreno.
What does Putin want? Putin can't keep Ukraine's territory. Maybe we don't even discuss Crimea, but he will have to rethink what he has invaded. Also, Zelensky can't have everything he wants to demand. NATO will not be able to set itself up at the border, so this is something we have to put on the table.
Eu acho que essa guerra já passou da conta. O Brasil já fez a crítica que tinha que fazer.
I think this war has dragged on for too long. Brazil has already criticized what it had to criticize. Brazil defends each nation's territorial integrity, so we disagree with Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
Because it looks like Ukraine is on the verge of a major counteroffensive against Russia. And in order to do this, needs massive support from Western countries, meaning military weapons. Can you talk about what China's role is here, the peace plan it has put forward, but also these other deals that China is helping to negotiate, like the successful rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and then what they're suggesting about Israel and Palestine?
President Lula uttered in a few words the core of this issue that most of our media dare not explain to the American people, and that is the expansion of NATO. This is a war fundamentally about the U.S. attempt to expand a U.S. military alliance to Ukraine and to Georgia. Georgia is a country in the Caucasus, also on the Black Sea. The U.S. strategy, going back decades, has been to surround Russia in the Black Sea, with Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, and Georgia, all NATO members surrounding Russia and its naval fleet in the Black Sea, with a naval fleet that has been the Black Sea naval fleet of Russia since 1783. Russia has said, this is our red line, and it has said that for decades. And it said this clearly in 2007, before George W. Bush Jr. had I'll call it the harebrained idea to announce in 2008 and force NATO to announce that Ukraine will be a member of NATO. And this is what President Lula was saying and what President Xi Jinping of China has been saying. We can't have a war that is essentially a proxy war between Russia and the United States over the expansion of the U.S. military alliance right up to a 1,200-kilometer and more border with Russia, which Russia views, and I would say understandably views, as a fundamental national security threat to Russia. Keep some space, keep some distance. That's President Lula's meaning. That's what China means when it says in its peace plan, we want a peace plan that respects the security interests of all parties. What that is code word for saying, make peace, end the war, but don't expand NATO right up to the border. The American people have not heard an explanation of this all along. It's shocking to me because as a close observer of this for 30 years, this has been the casus belli. And yet our newspapers won't even report the background to this. But this is why China, South Africa, India, Brazil are saying we want peace, but we don't want NATO expansion as the meaning of so-called peace. We want the big superpowers to give each other some space and some distance so that the world isn't on a knife edge. That's exactly what President Lula was saying, and it's exactly what the meaning of the Chinese peace initiative is to say, yes, absolutely make peace, protect Ukraine's sovereignty and its security, but no to NATO expansion. But the Biden administration won't even discuss this issue. That has been the major failing and the reason why we have not been able to get to the negotiating table, in my opinion. Even when Zelensky said in March 2022, maybe not NATO, maybe something else, Russia and Ukraine were close to an agreement, and the United States intervened with Ukraine and said, we don't think that's a good agreement, because the U.S. neocons, so-called, have been pushing for NATO enlargement as the core of this issue. But this goes back to the more general point for us, which is that what is at stake in Ukraine and over Taiwan and many other issues from the point of view of China or Russia or other countries, including Brazil, now Saudi Arabia, Iran, and others, is whether the U.S. does what it wants to do or whether the U.S. respects some limits based on what other countries say, well, this is what we think, so that we need true multipolarity, not U.S. dominance alone. Rules written by all of us, not rules written just by the United States.
And Jeff Sachs, we only have a few, about a minute left, but I was wondering if you could comment on the parallels between this expansion of NATO further and further east in Europe. This year marks the 200th anniversary of the Monroe Doctrine, of President Monroe declaring to all the European powers that the Western Hemisphere was off limits to them attempting to move their forces and their militaries into Latin America. And for these past 200 years, Latin America has essentially been the major sphere of influence of the United States. And yet here we are saying that Russia has no right to declare that its immediate the countries immediately its borders cannot welcome in NATO troops.
Well, yes, a little empathy would go a long way and would have spared us actually a lot of wars. But for Americans, it would be useful to think, suppose Mexico made a military alliance with China. Would the United States say, well, that's Mexico's right, what are we going to do about it? Or might there be actually an invasion in short order or something like that? I would strongly advise to China and Mexico, don't try it at home. Don't experiment with this. But the United States government refuses that empathy because, in other words, refuses to put itself in the position of the other side. That's the fundamental arrogance of thinking that you determine the rules of the world. The problem with arrogance is not only the comeuppance from it, but you stumble into terrible crises that you don't even understand because the United States has not been allowed, the public has not been allowed to even think from the perspective of the other side. So the analogy is actually a very, very clear analogy. It is what China and Russia and others say all the time is, why have those double standards? Why don't we actually deal with each other with mutual respect, not with the rules that you write?